Hey guys, tonight we begin with something darker than most fairy tales dare to tell. Medieval wedding nights weren't romantic beginnings filled with rose petals and gentle whispers. They were brutal displays of power, control, and social expectation that could destroy lives before they truly began. The young bride's cries would echo through castle walls loud enough for entire villages to hear, yet no one would intervene, because this was considered normal. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. When we imagine medieval weddings, today, our minds conjure images of grand feasts, flowing gowns, and romantic ceremonies in candlelit chapels. Hollywood has painted us a picture of chivalrous knights and blushing maidens, entering into unions blessed by love and hope. The reality was far more sinister. In medieval Europe, marriage was not about love, romance, or even personal choice. It was a business transaction, a political alliance, and often a sentence that could determine whether a young woman would survive to see her next birthday. The medieval world operated under a completely different set of values than our modern society. Women were not individuals with rights, dreams, or autonomy. They were property to be traded, bargaining chips in negotiations between families, and vessels for producing legitimate heirs. Their wedding night was not a celebration of union between two people who cared for each other. It was the final step in a transaction that had been negotiated, sometimes for years without their input or consent. To understand the true horror of medieval wedding nights, we must first understand the world that created them. Medieval Europe was a harsh, unforgiving place where survival often depended on strategic alliances and accumulated power. Marriage was one of the most important tools for building these alliances. A daughter was valuable only insofar as she could be used to secure favorable terms with another family, gain access to land, or solidify political relationships that might mean the difference between prosperity and ruin. The feudal system that dominated medieval society was built on a rigid hierarchy, where everyone had their place, and stepping outside those boundaries could mean death. At the top were kings and nobles who controlled vast territories and wielded absolute power over the people who lived on their lands. Below them were lesser nobles, knights, and clergy, who served the higher ranks in exchange for protection and land grants. At the bottom were peasants, serfs, and common folk who had no power, no rights, and no hope of changing their circumstances. Women existed within this system, but they had no independent status. A woman's position was entirely dependent on the men in her life, first her father, then her husband. She could not own property, make legal decisions, or even choose her own path in life. From the moment she was born, her future was being planned by others, and that future almost always involved marriage to someone she had never met, often someone significantly older, and frequently someone who saw her as nothing more than a means to an end. The church, which wielded enormous influence in medieval society, supported this system wholeheartedly. Religious doctrine taught that women were inherently inferior to men, that they were responsible for original sin, and that their proper role was to be submissive wives and mothers. Marriage was considered a sacrament, but it was also seen as a necessary evil, a way to channel sexual desire into socially acceptable forms, while ensuring the production of legitimate children who could inherit property and titles. Economic factors played a crucial role in medieval marriages. Families would begin negotiating marriage contracts when their daughters were still children, sometimes as young as 7 or 8 years old. These negotiations were complex affairs that involved detailed discussions of dowries, property transfers, inheritance rights, and political obligations. The bride herself was rarely consulted about these arrangements. Her feelings, preferences, and desires were considered irrelevant to the larger goals of family advancement and social stability. The dowry system that governed these marriages was particularly cruel. A family had to provide their daughter with enough money, goods, or property to make her attractive to potential suitors. This created tremendous pressure on families with limited resources, who might bankrupt themselves trying to secure advantageous marriages for their daughters. At the same time, it meant that wealthy families could essentially buy their way into higher social positions by offering enormous dowries that poorer families could not match. For the bride, this system was a nightmare. She would grow up knowing that her value was measured entirely in terms of what she could bring to a marriage arrangement. Her education, if she received any at all, focused on domestic skills like sewing, cooking, and managing a household. She was taught to be obedient, quiet, and submissive. Any display of independence, intelligence, or strong will was seen as a defect that would make her less desirable to potential husbands. The age at which girls were married varied depending on social class and economic circumstances, but it was always shockingly young by modern standards. Noble families often arranged marriages when their daughters were still children, and had them consummate these unions as soon as the girls showed signs of physical maturity. Common folk might wait slightly longer, but even peasant girls were usually married by their mid-teens to men who were often decades older. These marriages were not just early, they were also frequently violent and traumatic. The medieval world was a brutal place where might made right, and this brutality extended into the most intimate aspects of human relationships. Men were taught that they had absolute authority over their wives, and this authority included the right to use physical force to ensure obedience and submission. The wedding night was seen as the moment when this authority was established and demonstrated. It was not a private, intimate experience between two people beginning their life together. Instead, it was a public spectacle designed to prove that the marriage had been properly consummated, that the bride was indeed a virgin, and that the groom had successfully claimed his property. Medieval society was obsessed with female virginity, not because of any romantic idealization, but because it was seen as a guarantee of legitimacy for any children produced by the marriage. A woman who was not a virgin on her wedding night was considered damaged goods, and her family could face serious economic and social consequences if her lack of purity was discovered. This created enormous pressure to ensure that wedding nights were properly witnessed and verified. The methods used to verify a bride's virginity and the consummation of her marriage were invasive, humiliating, and often dangerous. Wedding guests would wait outside the bridal chamber, listening for sounds that would confirm that the deed had been done. In some cases, witnesses would actually enter the room to observe the proceedings directly. The bloodied sheets would be examined, and sometimes displayed as proof that the bride had been pure and that the marriage was now complete. For the bride, this meant that what should have been a private moment was instead a performance for an audience of strangers. She had no choice but to submit to whatever her new husband demanded, knowing that her family's honor and her own survival depended on satisfying the expectations of people who saw her as nothing more than a commodity to be consumed. The physical and emotional trauma of these experiences was compounded by the fact that most brides received no preparation for what was about to happen to them. Medieval society was extremely prudish about discussing sexual matters openly, especially with young women. Girls would enter their wedding chambers with little or no understanding of what was expected of them, making an already terrifying experience even more confusing and traumatic. The men who participated in these rituals were products of the same violent hierarchical society that created them. They had been raised to see women as inferior beings whose primary purpose was to serve male needs and desire. Many had learned about sexuality through encounters with prostitutes or servants, relationships characterized by power imbalances and transactional dynamics, rather than mutual care and respect. This combination of factors, young, unprepared brides, older men raised in a culture of masculine dominance, social expectations of violent demonstration of authority, and public pressure for immediate consummation, created a perfect storm of trauma and abuse that was considered not only normal, but necessary for the proper functioning of society. The long-term effects of these traumatic wedding nights ripple through medieval society in ways that are still difficult to fully comprehend. Women who survived their early marriages often spent the rest of their lives dealing with physical injury, psychological trauma, and a deep-seated fear of intimacy that would affect every subsequent relationship they had. Children born from these unions inherited a legacy of violence and dysfunction that perpetuated the cycle of abuse from generation to generation. Boys learned that masculine power was demonstrated through the domination and control of women, while girls learned that their role in life was to submit to male authority, regardless of the personal cost. The medieval world was not a romantic fantasy of knights and princesses living happily ever after. It was a harsh, brutal reality, where power determined survival, and women bore the brunt of that brutality in ways that were considered not only acceptable but essential to maintaining social order. The wedding night was just the beginning of a lifetime of submission, service, and suffering that defined the female experience in medieval Europe. Understanding this history is important not because we should judge our ancestors by modern standards, but because we should recognize how far we have come and how precious the freedoms we now take for granted really are. The young brides who suffered through medieval wedding nights were not different from us. They had the same capacity for joy, love, and fulfillment that we do. They simply lived in a world that denied them the opportunity to experience those things. Tonight, as we explore the darker corners of medieval marriage customs, we honor their memory by acknowledging their suffering and learning from their experiences. Their stories remind us that progress is never guaranteed, that human rights must be constantly defended, and that the society we live in today was built on the sacrifices of countless women whose names have been forgotten by history but whose pain echoes across the centuries. The concept of appropriate marriage age in medieval Europe would horrify any modern parent. While today we consider 18 to be the minimum age for adult decision-making, medieval families routinely arranged marriages for daughters who were barely out of childhood. These weren't exceptional cases or scandalous aberrations. They were the norm, accepted and even encouraged by both religious and secular authorities, who saw young brides as ideal for molding into obedient wives. The practice of child marriage in medieval times was driven by a complex web of economic, political, and social factors that prioritized family advancement over individual welfare. Noble families would begin considering marriage alliances for their daughters almost from the moment of birth, viewing these children as valuable assets that could be leveraged to secure advantageous relationships with other powerful families. The younger the bride, the more malleable she would be, and the more time she would have to produce the male heirs that were essential for continuing family bloodline. Canon law, the legal system of the medieval Catholic Church, technically set the minimum age of marriage at 12 for girls and 14 for boys. However, this legal framework was regularly ignored in practice. The betrothal ceremonies, which were considered binding contracts, could take place when children were as young as 7 years old. These early betrothals locked children into marriage arrangements they had no power to escape, regardless of how they might feel about their intended spouse as they grew older. The Church's position on marriage age was contradictory and ultimately harmful to the young women it claimed to protect. While religious authorities acknowledged that very young children could not truly consent to marriage, They also supported a system that made such consent irrelevant. Parents and guardians were given absolute authority to make marriage decisions for their children, and religious blessing of these arrangements gave them an aura of divine approval that made resistance seem not just futile but sinful. For noble families, the stakes of marriage negotiations were particularly high. A well-arranged marriage could elevate a family's social status, expand their territorial holdings, and create powerful political alliances that would benefit multiple generations. Conversely, a poorly arranged marriage or a daughter who remained unmarried could be seen as a strategic failure that would haunt a family for decades. This created enormous pressure to arrange marriages as early as possible, before other families could secure better matches for their own daughters. The economic aspects of medieval marriage made young brides particularly attractive to potential husbands and their families. A 12 or 13-year-old girl had many more childbearing years ahead of her than an 18 or 20-year-old woman. In a world with extremely high infant mortality rates and constant threats to adult survival, maximizing the number of years available for producing children was seen as a crucial advantage. Each additional year of fertility could mean the difference between securing a family's bloodline and facing the catastrophic prospect of dying without male heirs. Young brides were also seen as more likely to successfully adapt to their new families and circumstances. Medieval society valued female obedience and submission above all other qualities in wives, and it was believed that girls who married very young would more easily accept their subordinate role. An older woman who had more time to develop her own personality and preferences might prove more difficult to control, making her a less desirable marriage partner despite her greater maturity and life experience. The process of arranging marriages for young daughters was typically handled entirely by fathers and other male relatives, with mothers playing only a minor advisory role. These negotiations could take months or even years to complete, involving detailed discussions of dowries, inheritance rights, property transfers, and political obligations. Throughout these extensive negotiations, the bride herself remained a silent participant, whose feelings and preferences were never consulted. Marriage contracts from this period reveal the coldly calculating nature of these arrangements. Documents would specify not only the financial terms of the marriage, but also detailed provisions about what would happen if the bride died before producing children, if she proved to be infertile, or if political circumstances changed in ways that affected the value of the alliance. The bride was discussed in these contracts like a piece of property being sold, with careful attention paid to her condition, her potential productivity, and her market value. The psychological impact of growing up under this system was devastating for young girls. From early childhood, they understood that their primary value lay in their eventual marriage to someone they had never met. Their education, when they received any at all, focused exclusively on skills that would make them better wives and mothers: needlework, household management, basic literacy for managing domestic accounts, and most importantly, unquestioning obedience to male authority. Girls in noble families were often sent away from their birth families at very young ages to live with their future in-laws, a practice designed to help them adapt to their new circumstances before the formal marriage took place. These children, sometimes as young as 8 or 9, would be separated from everyone they had ever known and placed in households where they were expected to serve and please people who saw them primarily as investments in their family's future. The emotional toll of this separation was compounded by the uncertainty these young girls faced about their futures. They knew that their comfort, safety, and even survival would depend on satisfying the expectations of people who had purchased them, like commodities. They were taught that any resistance or displeasure on their part could result in their rejection and return to their birth families in disgrace, a fate that would ruin not only their own prospects but potentially those of their sisters as well. For peasant families, the dynamics of early marriage were different but no less harsh. While common folk could not arrange marriages with the same political and economic complexity as noble families, They still faced enormous pressure to marry off their daughters as early as possible. Daughters represented economic burdens who consumed resources without producing significant income, and marrying them off transferred this burden to their husbands' families, while sometimes bringing in small dowries that could help support remaining family members. Peasant girls were typically married to young men from neighboring villages or to older widowers who needed wives to help manage their households and care for children from previous marriages. These marriages were usually arranged by the girls' fathers in consultation with local community leaders, religious authorities, and the lord who owned the land where they lived. The bride's consent was no more relevant in peasant marriages than it was in noble ones, though the ceremonies were much simpler and less elaborate. The physical dangers of early marriage were well known to medieval society, but they were considered acceptable risks in pursuit of larger family goals. Young girls who became pregnant immediately after marriage faced extremely high rates of death in childbirth, as their bodies were not yet fully developed enough to safely carry and deliver babies. Those who survived their first pregnancies often suffered permanent physical damage that would affect their health for the rest of their lives. Medical knowledge in medieval times was extremely limited, and much of what was believed about female anatomy and reproduction was completely wrong. Doctors and midwives had little understanding of the physical and emotional development that continued to occur during the teenage years, and they had no effective treatments for the complications that frequently arose when very young girls became pregnant. The attitude toward these preventable tragedies was generally fatalistic. Death in childbirth was seen as a natural consequence of female sinfulness rather than as a result of harmful social practices. The social pressure surrounding early marriage was reinforced by religious teachings that emphasized female submission and the importance of producing children as quickly as possible after marriage. Young brides were taught that their primary duty was to provide their husbands with sons who could inherit property and continue family names. Any delay in fulfilling this obligation was seen as a failure that reflected poorly on their character and their families. This pressure was particularly intense for noble brides, whose marriages were often arranged specifically to produce heirs who would unite the properties and claims of two powerful families. The failure to quickly produce male children could result in the marriage being annulled, the bride being returned to her family in disgrace, or even accusations of witchcraft or divine punishment. The psychological stress of carrying this enormous responsibility while still being a child themselves contributed to the high rates of mental illness and early death among medieval wives. The few women who attempted to resist early marriage faced severe consequences that served as warnings to others who might consider similar rebellion. Religious authorities taught that defiance of parental marriage arrangements was a sin against God, while secular law gave fathers absolute authority over their daughters' marriage decision. Girls who ran away to avoid unwanted marriages could be forcibly returned and punished, while those who refused to cooperate with wedding ceremonies could be physically compelled to participate. Some families employed extreme measures to ensure their daughters' compliance with marriage arrangements. Girls might be kept under close supervision for months before their weddings to prevent any possibility of escape, or they might be told false information about their intended husbands to make the arrangements seem more appealing. In extreme cases, girls were drugged or physically restrained during wedding ceremonies to ensure that the legal requirements for marriage were fulfilled. The long-term effects of these early marriages extended far beyond the individual trauma experienced by young brides. The normalization of child marriage created a society where the exploitation and abuse of young women was not only accepted but celebrated as a necessary component of family honor and social stability. Generation after generation of women grew up understanding that their value was entirely dependent on their usefulness to men, and that their own desires and well-being were irrelevant to the larger goals of family advancement. The cycle of trauma perpetuated by early marriage also affected the children born from these unions. Mothers who had been traumatized by their own experiences often struggled to form healthy emotional bonds with their children, while fathers who had learned to see women as property passed these attitudes on to their sons. Daughters grew up watching their mothers suffering and understanding that the same fate awaited them, while sons learned that masculine power was demonstrated through the domination and control of women. The medieval system of early marriage was not an accidental byproduct of harsh living conditions or limited understanding of child development. It was a deliberate social structure designed to maximize male power and family wealth at the expense of female autonomy and well-being. The young brides who suffered under this system were not unfortunate victims of historical circumstances. They were sacrificial offerings to a social order that valued property and power over human dignity and individual rights. Understanding this history helps us recognize how recent and fragile our modern concepts of childhood protection and women's rights really are. The progress we have made in recognizing the fundamental humanity and rights of young women was built on the suffering of countless medieval brides whose stories were never recorded, whose pain was never acknowledged, and whose brief lives were consumed by a system that saw them as nothing more than vessels for producing the next generation of men who would continue the cycle of exploitation and abuse. Medieval wedding ceremonies were elaborate theatrical productions designed to publicly demonstrate family wealth, political alliances, and social status. But beneath the pageantry and celebration lay a darker purpose. These rituals served to formally transfer ownership of a young woman from her father to her husband, marking the moment when she would lose what little autonomy she had ever possessed and enter a life of complete subjugation. The wedding day itself was the culmination of months or even years of preparation, negotiation, and anticipation. For the bride's family, it represented the successful completion of a crucial business transaction that could elevate their social standing, secure important political connections, or provide desperately needed financial relief. For the bride herself, it marked the end of childhood and the beginning of what was often a short, difficult life defined entirely by her ability to satisfy her husband's needs and produce male heirs. Medieval wedding ceremonies were deeply religious events that took place within the context of Catholic ritual and doctrine. The Church taught that marriage was a sacrament blessed by God, but the reality of these ceremonies had little to do with divine blessing and everything to do with human power and control. The religious elements of the wedding served primarily to give sacred legitimacy to what was essentially a property transfer, making resistance to the arrangement seem not just futile but sinful. The preparation phase leading up to a medieval wedding was exhausting and often traumatic for the bride. She would be subjected to intensive instruction in her duties as a wife, which included not only domestic skills like cooking and household management, but also detailed guidance about her obligations to submit to her husband's authority in all matters. This instruction was often delivered by older women who had themselves survived similar marriages and who understood that preparing the bride for the realities of her new life was essential for her survival. Physical preparation for the wedding was equally demanding. The bride would be bathed, often for one of the few times in her life, using expensive soaps and oils that were normally reserved for special occasions. Her hair would be elaborately arranged, and she would be dressed in the finest clothing her family could afford, usually a gown that had been specifically created for the wedding and that represented a significant financial investment. The wedding dress itself was loaded with symbolic meaning. The color white, which we associate with bridal purity today, was actually quite rare in medieval weddings, because white fabric was extremely difficult to keep clean and was therefore impractical for most families. Instead, brides typically wore their best dress in whatever color was available, often blue, which was associated with the Virgin Mary and was thought to convey religious blessing on the union. The most important aspect of the bride's preparation was the verification of her virginity, a process that was both humiliating and invasive. Older women, usually relatives of the groom's family, would examine the bride to ensure that she had not been damaged by previous sexual contact. This examination was considered essential because the bride's virginity was quite literally part of what was being purchased through the marriage arrangement, and any deception about her condition could void the entire contract. The wedding ceremony itself typically took place at the entrance to the church rather than inside the building, reflecting the church's somewhat ambivalent attitude toward marriage. While religious authorities recognized marriage as a sacrament, They also viewed it as a concession to human weakness and sexual desire that was necessary but not entirely spiritual. The couple would exchange vows in front of the church doors, with a priest presiding but the actual commitment taking place in the public space rather than within the sacred interior of the building. These vows were not the romantic promises of mutual love and support that characterize modern wedding ceremonies. Instead, they were formal legal declarations that established the husband's authority over his wife and the wife's obligation to obey and serve him. The bride would promise to be bonny and buxom in bed and at board, a phrase that explicitly acknowledged her sexual availability and domestic servitude as fundamental aspects of her role in the marriage. The groom's vows, by contrast, focused primarily on his obligation to provide for and protect his wife. But these promises were understood to be conditional on her good behavior and compliance with his wishes. If she failed to meet his expectations, he was considered to be released from any obligation to treat her well. This asymmetry in marriage vows reflected the broader gender dynamics of medieval society, where women had responsibilities without rights, while men had rights without corresponding responsibility. The exchange of rings during medieval wedding ceremonies had a very different meaning than it does today. Rather than symbolizing mutual commitment and love, the wedding ring represented ownership and possession. The groom would place a ring on his bride's finger as a public demonstration that she now belonged to him, much like a brand might be placed on livestock to indicate ownership. The bride did not give a ring to the groom because the transaction was unidirectional. She was being given to him, not entering into a mutual partnership. Wedding guests at medieval ceremonies were not simply friends and family members celebrating a happy occasion. They were witnesses to a legal and social transaction, who served important functions in legitimizing the marriage and ensuring that it would be recognized by both religious and secular authorities. The presence of prominent community members at a wedding helped to establish the social status of both families and created a network of people who would be expected to support and enforce the marriage arrangement. The wedding feast that followed the ceremony was often the most expensive part of the entire event, representing a significant financial investment that could bankrupt smaller families. These feasts served multiple purposes beyond simple celebration. They provided an opportunity for the bride's family to display their wealth and social connections, for the groom's family to assess what they were gaining through the marriage alliance, and for both families to cement their relationship through shared hospitality and gift-giving. The food served at medieval wedding feasts was elaborate and symbolic. Multiple courses would be presented, often featuring expensive ingredients like spices, sugar, and imported wines that demonstrated the family's prosperity and international connections. The bride and groom would be seated at the head table where they could be observed throughout the feast, with particular attention paid to their interaction and the bride's deportment. During the feast, various rituals would take place that were designed to ensure fertility and prosperity for the new couple. Guests might throw grain or flowers at the bride and groom, or special foods believed to promote fertility would be served. These customs reflected the central importance of reproduction in medieval marriage, emphasizing that the primary purpose of the union was to produce children rather than to create happiness for the individuals involved. The entertainment at wedding feasts often included ribald jokes, songs, and performances that dealt explicitly with sexual themes. These were not simply crude humor. They served to publicly reinforce expectations about the couple's sexual obligations and to create social pressure for immediate consummation of the marriage. The bride, often still a young teenager, would be subjected to increasingly explicit comments and suggestions as the evening progressed, creating an atmosphere of sexual anticipation and pressure that would culminate in the bedding ceremony. Music and dancing were important components of medieval wedding celebrations, but they followed strict social protocols that reinforced the hierarchical nature of medieval society. The bride and groom would lead the dancing, followed by their families in order of social importance, and finally by other guests according to their rank and status. The bride's participation in these dances was carefully observed for signs of her character and disposition. Too much enthusiasm might suggest immodesty, while too little might indicate an unsuitable temperament. Gift-giving at medieval weddings was a complex social ritual that involved careful calculation of relative status, future obligations, and political relationships. Wealthy guests were expected to provide generous gifts that reflected their ability to support the new couple and their families, while the gifts they received in return served as indicators of how highly their support was valued. These exchanges created networks of obligation and reciprocity that could last for generations. The bride's trousseau, the collection of clothing, household items, and personal possessions she brought to her marriage, was displayed during the wedding celebration as evidence of her family's investment in the union and her preparedness for domestic duties. This display served not only to demonstrate wealth, but also to establish expectations about her role in managing her new household and maintaining appropriate standards of domestic comfort. As the wedding day progressed toward evening, the atmosphere would become increasingly charged with anticipation about the bedding ceremony that would follow. Guests would begin making more explicit comments about the couple's upcoming intimate encounter, and preparations would begin for the ritualized transfer of the bride to the marital chamber. This transition from public celebration to private consummation was managed with careful attention to social customs that were designed to ensure proper witness to the marriage's completion. The religious aspects of medieval weddings extended beyond the formal ceremony to include blessings of the marriage bed, special prayers for fertility, and sometimes the presence of religious relics that were believed to promote successful childbearing. These spiritual elements were taken very seriously by medieval people, who understood that supernatural forces could significantly influence the success or failure of a marriage. For many brides, the wedding day represented the last time they would ever be the center of positive attention or celebration. Once the ceremony was complete and the marriage consummated, they would assume their roles as subordinate members of their husbands' households, expected to work quietly and efficiently without drawing attention to themselves or their needs. The elaborate celebration of their wedding day stood in stark contrast to the anonymity and hardship that would characterize the rest of their lives. The contrast between the public celebration of medieval weddings and the private reality of medieval marriage reveals the fundamental hypocrisy of a social system that claimed to honor and protect women, while systematically exploiting and abusing them. The same society that spent enormous resources on wedding ceremonies that celebrated female beauty and virtue also created legal and social structures that stripped women of all autonomy and reduced them to the status of property. Understanding the true nature of medieval wedding ceremonies helps us recognize how celebrations and rituals can be used to disguise and legitimize systems of oppression. The pageantry and religious blessing that surrounded these events created an illusion of divine approval and social celebration that masked the fundamental violence being done to young women who had no choice but to participate in their own subjugation. The medieval wedding was not a celebration of love or commitment between two equal partners choosing to build a life together. It was a public ceremony marking the successful completion of a business transaction in which a young woman was sold to a man who would have complete authority over her body, her labor, and her future. The elaborate rituals and expensive festivities that surrounded these events served to legitimize this transaction and create social pressure for compliance with arrangements that few women would have chosen for themselves. The bedding ceremony was perhaps the most invasive and traumatic aspect of medieval wedding traditions, a ritualized spectacle that transformed what should have been an intimate moment between two people into a public performance designed to verify that the marriage had been properly consummated. This practice reveals the medieval world's obsession with controlling female sexuality and ensuring the legitimacy of inheritance lines, even at the cost of basic human dignity and privacy. The ceremony typically began as the wedding feast was winding down, when guests who had been celebrating throughout the day would suddenly shift their attention to the more serious business of ensuring that the marriage was legally and practically complete. The bride, who may have been as young as 12 or 13, would find herself surrounded by a crowd of adults whose cheerful demeanor during the feast now gave way to a more predatory anticipation of what was about to unfold. The ritual had deep roots in medieval law and custom, stemming from the practical need to prove that a marriage had been consummated in societies where inheritance rights, political alliances, and family honor depended on clear evidence of sexual union. In a world without modern documentation systems or reliable record-keeping, physical evidence of consummation was considered essential for establishing the validity of marriage contracts and preventing future disputes about inheritance or legitimacy. The process began with the formal procession of the bride and groom to the marital chamber, accompanied by wedding guests who sang traditional songs, made crude jokes, and offered advice that was often explicitly sexual in nature. This procession was designed to create public awareness of what was about to happen and to build social pressure for the couple to fulfill their obligations quickly and definitively. The bride would be escorted by the women in attendance, who would help her prepare for the ordeal ahead. This preparation involved removing her wedding dress and replacing it with a special nightgown, often white or light-colored, to better show any blood that might result from the encounter. The women would offer advice, prayers, and sometimes herbal preparations that were believed to ease pain or promote fertility. But their primary role was to ensure that the bride understood what was expected of her and would comply without resistance. Meanwhile, the groom would be prepared by the men, who would engage in ritualized encouragement that often took the form of crude jokes, sexual boasting, and detailed advice about techniques for ensuring that the encounter would produce clear evidence of consummation. These conversations served not only to prepare the groom but also to reinforce masculine expectations about sexual dominance and the importance of demonstrating virility through forceful action. The marriage bed itself was often specially prepared for the occasion, with particular attention paid to the sheets and bedding that would later be examined for proof of the bride's virginity and the success of the consummation. Clean white linens were preferred because they would better show any blood, and sometimes special herbs or flowers would be scattered on the bed for their supposed magical properties in promoting fertility and marital happiness. Once the couple was in the bedchamber, the nature of the witnessing varied according to social class and local custom. In some cases, guests would remain outside the room, but close enough to hear what was happening inside, listening for sounds that would indicate that consummation was taking place. These witnesses would often make comments and offer encouragement, creating a deeply uncomfortable situation for the bride who was expected to perform not just for her husband, but for an audience of strangers. In more extreme cases, particularly among the nobility where the stakes were highest, actual witnesses might be present in the room during the consummation itself. These could include religious figures, family representatives, or other important community members whose testimony about what they had observed would be considered legally binding. The psychological impact on the bride of performing such an intimate act under direct observation was devastating, but her emotional well-being was considered irrelevant compared to the need for reliable witnesses. The examination that followed the consummation was often more traumatic than the sexual encounter itself. The bride would be subjected to physical inspection by older women who would look for evidence of virginity and sexual activity. This examination was invasive and humiliating, conducted by people who had no medical training but who claimed the authority to make determinations about the bride's condition based on folk beliefs and superstitions about female anatomy. The bloodied sheets that resulted from the consummation were treated as crucial evidence that would be preserved, displayed, and sometimes even sent to important family members who had not been present at the wedding. These sheets served as proof that the bride had indeed been a virgin and that the marriage had been properly consummated, protecting both families from potential accusations of fraud or deception. The social pressure surrounding the bedding ceremony was immense, particularly for noble families where marriage alliances involved significant political and economic stakes. A bride who failed to bleed sufficiently might find herself accused of not being a virgin, which could void the marriage contract and bring disgrace upon both families. Even worse, a bride who appeared to resist or refuse to cooperate with the consummation could be accused of preventing the marriage from being completed, making her responsible for any negative consequences that might result. For the bride, the bedding ceremony represented the moment when any illusions about her new life were brutally shattered. She would discover that her body was not her own, that her privacy was not respected, and that her comfort and dignity were considered entirely expendable in service of social and legal requirements that she had no power to influence or resist. The psychological impact of this experience was compounded by the fact that most brides received little or no preparation for what would happen to them. Medieval society was extremely secretive about sexual matters, particularly when it came to educating young women. So many brides entered their wedding chambers with only the vaguest understanding of what was about to occur. The shock of discovering the true nature of their situation, combined with physical pain and public humiliation, created trauma that would affect them for the rest of their lives. The men who participated in these ceremonies were products of a society that taught them to view women as property and sexual conquest as a demonstration of masculine worth. Many had learned about sexuality through encounters with prostitutes, servants, or other women who had no power to refuse their advances, creating expectations about sexual relationships that were based on dominance and submission rather than mutual respect and care. The religious justification for bedding ceremonies was particularly the cynical, as church authorities simultaneously endorsed these practices while preaching about the sanctity and privacy of marriage. Religious doctrine taught that marriage was a sacrament blessed by God, but the same religious leaders who proclaimed this divine blessing also insisted on invasive verification procedures that treated the marriage bed like a battlefield where conquest had to be proven through visible evidence of victory. The clergy's involvement in bedding ceremonies revealed the fundamental contradiction at the heart of medieval Christianity's approach to sexuality and marriage. While the Church officially taught that sexual relations within marriage were blessed by God and should be conducted with dignity and respect, the practical implementation of these teachings involved rituals that were degrading, invasive, and traumatic for the women involved. Some religious authorities went so far as to argue that the bedding ceremony was necessary to ensure that marriages were valid in the eyes of God, claiming that without proper consummation and witness, the spiritual bond between husband and wife could not be established. This theological justification provided cover for practices that had much more to do with property rights and inheritance law than with spiritual concerns. But it gave these brutal customs an aura of divine approval that made resistance seem both futile and sinful. The variation in bedding ceremony practices across different regions and social classes reveals how these customs were adapted to serve the specific needs of different communities, while maintaining their core function of establishing male control over female sexuality. In some areas, the ceremony was relatively brief and private, involving only immediate family members as witnesses. In others, particularly where political alliances were involved, the rituals could extend for hours and involve dozens of participants. Noble families often developed elaborate protocols for bedding ceremonies that reflected their social status and political importance. These might include special blessings from high-ranking clergy, the presence of foreign ambassadors or other political dignitaries, and detailed documentation of the proceedings that would be preserved in family archives as evidence of the marriage's validity. The more important the political implications of the marriage, the more elaborate and invasive the verification procedures became. For royal marriages, the bedding ceremony could become a matter of international significance, with representatives from multiple kingdoms present to witness the consummation and verify that the alliance had been properly sealed. These ceremonies were conducted with the formality of state occasions, with every detail carefully orchestrated to ensure that no questions could later be raised about the validity of the union or the legitimacy of any children that might result from it. The emotional toll of these public ceremonies on young brides was devastating. but it was considered an acceptable price to pay for the security and stability that properly witnessed marriages were believed to provide. The medieval world was obsessed with legitimacy and inheritance rights, and the bedding ceremony was seen as an essential safeguard against the chaos that could result from disputed claims or uncertain bloodlines. The physical dangers of the bedding ceremony were well known but rarely discussed openly. Many young brides suffered serious injuries during forced consummation, particularly when they were very young or when their husbands were much larger and more experienced. These injuries could lead to infections, permanent disability, or death, but such outcomes were generally attributed to divine will or female weakness rather than to the brutal nature of the practices themselves. Medical knowledge in medieval times was extremely limited, and much of what was believed about female anatomy was completely wrong. The idea that all virgins would bleed during their first sexual encounter was taken as absolute fact, despite the reality that many factors could influence this outcome. Brides who did not bleed sufficiently might find themselves subjected to additional examinations, accused of deception, or even rejected by their new husbands, despite having done nothing wrong. The social dynamics of bedding ceremonies also created opportunities for abuse and exploitation that went far beyond the official purposes of these rituals. Male guests who had been drinking throughout the wedding celebration might use the ceremony as an excuse to make inappropriate comments or advances toward the bride, while female witnesses might use their authority to humiliate or intimidate young women who reminded them of their own traumatic experiences. The long-term psychological effects of bedding ceremonies extended far beyond the wedding night itself. Women who had been subjected to these rituals often developed lasting fears of intimacy that affected their relationships with their husbands throughout their marriages. The knowledge that their most private moments could be subject to public scrutiny and judgment created a sense of constant vulnerability that made genuine emotional and physical intimacy nearly impossible. Children who were born from marriages that began with traumatic bedding ceremonies inherited a legacy of dysfunction that affected their own understanding of relationships and sexuality. Boys learned that masculine power was demonstrated through the domination and humiliation of women, while girls learned that their value as human beings was contingent on their ability to satisfy male demands regardless of their own comfort or well-being. The economic aspects of bedding ceremonies also created additional pressure on young brides to comply with whatever was demanded of them. Families had often invested enormous resources in marriage negotiations and wedding celebrations, and the failure to complete the marriage through proper consummation could result in financial ruin for multiple generations. Brides understood that their resistance or non-compliance could destroy not only their own futures, but also the prospects of their siblings and other family members. The legal framework surrounding bedding ceremonies gave husbands tremendous power over their wives that extended far beyond the wedding night itself. A man who claimed that his wife had not been a virgin or had refused to consummate their marriage could use this as grounds for annulment, divorce, or even more severe punishment. This created a system where women had to prove their compliance and submission from the very beginning of their marriages, establishing patterns of control that would dominate their entire lives. The social isolation experienced by brides during and after bedding ceremonies was another form of psychological torture that served to reinforce their powerlessness and dependence on their husband's goodwill. Cut off from their birth families and surrounded by strangers who viewed them primarily as breeding stock, these young women had nowhere to turn for comfort or support when they were traumatized by their experiences. The bedding ceremony represented the final step in a process that had transformed a young girl from a person with at least some family protection into a piece of property owned entirely by her husband. The public nature of this transformation served as a warning to other young women about what awaited them and as a demonstration to the community that traditional gender hierarchies were being properly maintained. The normalization of these practices in medieval society reveals how quickly human beings can adapt to accept even the most degrading and harmful customs when they are presented as necessary for social stability. The same communities that would have been horrified by random acts of violence or sexual assault readily participated in ritualized forms of the same behaviors when they were framed as legitimate marriage customs. Understanding the true nature of medieval bedding ceremonies helps us recognize how social rituals and religious customs can be used to legitimize and perpetuate systems of oppression. The elaborate protocols and ceremonial aspects of these practices created an illusion of dignity and respectability that masked the fundamental violence being done to young women who had no power to protect themselves. The legacy of bedding ceremonies extended far beyond the medieval period, influencing attitudes about marriage, sexuality, and women's rights that persisted for centuries afterward. The idea that women's bodies were subject to public scrutiny and that their sexual experiences were legitimate matters of community interest created patterns of thinking that continued to shape law and custom long after the specific practices of the medieval period had been abandoned. The young women who endured these ceremonies were not willing participants in romantic rituals. They were victims of a systematic form of abuse that was sanctioned by law, blessed by religion, and celebrated by society. Their suffering reminds us that progress in human rights is never guaranteed and that the freedoms we enjoy today were built on the sacrifices of countless women whose pain has been forgotten, but whose experience continues to echo through history. The feudal system that dominated medieval Europe created a complex web of obligations and privileges that gave lords extraordinary power over the lives of the people who lived on their lands, including the right to control and exploit the marriages of their subjects. Among the most notorious of these privileges was the concept of prima nocta, or jus prima noctis, the alleged right of a feudal lord to spend the first night with any newly married woman in his territory. While historians debate whether this practice was as widespread as medieval sources suggest, its very existence as a legal concept reveals the depth of control that feudal lords exercised over the most intimate aspects of their subjects' lives. The feudal system was built on the principle that land ownership granted not just economic control but also personal authority over everyone who lived and worked on that land. Peasants and serfs were bound to the soil they worked, unable to leave without their lord's permission, and their entire lives were subject to the will of the noble who owned their village. This included decisions about when they could marry, whom they could marry, and under what conditions their marriages would be permitted to take place. Lords justified their control over peasant marriages through a combination of legal tradition, religious doctrine, and practical economics. They argued that they had invested in their peasants by providing them with land to work and protection from external threats, and that this investment gave them the right to ensure that marriages would not interfere with agricultural productivity or the stability of their territories. A peasant who married someone from another lord's land might try to move away, taking valuable labor with them. So marriage permissions served as a form of population control. The economic motivations behind lordly control of marriages were significant and complex. Peasant families represented valuable resources that generated income through agricultural labor, craft production, and various taxes and fees. When a peasant woman married, her lord lost her labor and any future children she might produce who could work his lands. To compensate for this loss, lords typically required payment of a merciat, a marriage tax that could represent months or even years of a peasant family's income. The merciat system created enormous hardship for peasant families who were already struggling to survive on minimal resources. Fathers had to choose between allowing their daughters to remain unmarried, which violated social expectations and religious teachings, or bankrupting their families to pay marriage taxes that enriched their lords while impoverishing everyone else. This financial pressure often forced families to accept marriage arrangements that they would not have chosen under better circumstances. Beyond the simple payment of marriage taxes, feudal lords also claimed the right to approve or disapprove specific marriage matches based on their own interests and preferences. A lord might forbid a marriage if he felt that it would reduce his control over valuable peasants, or he might insist on marriages that served his political or economic goals rather than the wishes of the families involved. This gave lords tremendous power to manipulate the personal lives of their subjects in ways that served noble interests at the expense of peasant happiness and well-being. The concept of prima nocta emerged from this broader system of feudal control over marriage, representing the ultimate expression of lordly authority over peasant sexuality. According to legal documents and chronicles from the period, some lords claimed the right to sleep with any bride in their territory on her wedding night, before her new husband was permitted to consummate the marriage. This practice was presented as an ancient privilege that came with land ownership, similar to the right to collect taxes or demand military service. The historical reality of prima nocta has been debated by scholars for centuries, with some arguing that it was primarily a symbolic right that was rarely exercised, while others contend that it was a genuine practice that was used to humiliate and control peasant populations. The truth likely varies by region and time period, but the existence of legal documents acknowledging and regulating this right suggests that it was more than merely theoretical in at least some parts of medieval Europe. Whether or not prima nocta was widely practiced, its existence as a legal concept had devastating psychological effects on peasant communities. The knowledge that their lords claimed sexual authority over their wives and daughters created a constant atmosphere of fear and vulnerability that affected every aspect of peasant life. Even if the right was rarely exercised, its mere existence served as a reminder of the absolute powerlessness of common people in the face of noble authority. The religious justification for prima nocta and other forms of feudal marriage control was typically based on the medieval understanding of hierarchy and divine order. Church authorities taught that God had established different social classes for specific purposes, with nobles responsible for governing and protecting their inferiors. This divine hierarchy supposedly gave lords not just the right but the obligation to oversee all aspects of their subjects' lives, including their marriages and sexual relationships. Some religious sources attempted to find biblical precedent for prima nocta by referencing Old Testament passages about the rights of rulers and the obligations of subjects. These interpretations were often stretched beyond any reasonable reading of Scripture, but they provided a veneer of religious legitimacy for practices that served primarily to reinforce noble power and privilege at the expense of common people's dignity and autonomy. The practical implementation of feudal marriage rights varied significantly across different regions and among different lords. Some nobles were content to collect marriage taxes without interfering further in their subjects' personal lives, while others took a much more active role in controlling and exploiting peasant marriages. The personality and character of individual lords could make the difference between marriages that were merely expensive and those that were genuinely traumatic for the families involved. In some cases, lords would use their marriage authority to reward loyal subjects or punish those who had displeased them. A peasant who had served faithfully might find his daughter's marriage tax reduced or waived entirely, while a family that had caused problems might face additional restrictions or requirements that made marriage nearly impossible. This arbitrary exercise of power created constant uncertainty and anxiety among peasant populations who never knew how their lords' moods might affect their family's future prospects. The resistance to feudal marriage controls took many forms, from subtle non-compliance to open rebellion. Some peasant families would attempt to arrange marriages secretly, without seeking their lord's permission, though discovery of such arrangements could result in severe punishment, including imprisonment, heavy fines, or even physical violence. Others might try to negotiate with their lords, offering alternative forms of service or payment in exchange for marriage permission. More organized resistance sometimes emerged during periods of social unrest when peasant communities would collectively refuse to pay marriage taxes or submit to other forms of feudal control. These rebellions were typically crushed violently by noble armies, with participants facing execution, mutilation, or other brutal punishments designed to discourage future resistance. The few successful peasant uprisings that managed to achieve temporary relief from feudal marriage controls were usually reversed as soon as noble authority was re-established. The legal framework surrounding feudal marriage rights was complex and often contradictory, reflecting the tension between different sources of authority in medieval society. Canon law, the legal system of the Catholic Church, officially taught that marriage was a sacrament that required the free consent of both parties. But this principle was routinely ignored when it conflicted with feudal privileges and practical politics. Secular law varied significantly between different kingdoms and regions, but generally supported the authority of feudal lords over their subjects' marriages. Royal courts were often reluctant to interfere with the traditional privileges of the nobility, even when those privileges clearly violated principles of human dignity and personal autonomy that were beginning to emerge in medieval legal thinking. The economic impact of feudal marriage controls extended far beyond the immediate families involved, affecting entire communities and regions. The requirement to pay marriage taxes diverted resources that might otherwise have been invested in agricultural improvements, craft production, or other activities that could have increased prosperity for everyone. The arbitrary nature of lordly authority over marriages also made it difficult for peasant communities to plan for the future or develop stable economic relationships. The social consequences of feudal marriage controls were equally devastating, creating divisions within peasant communities between those who could afford to marry and those who could not. Families that were unable to pay marriage taxes might see their daughters remain unmarried indefinitely, violating social expectations and religious teachings while depriving the community of potential new households and children. The psychological trauma inflicted by feudal marriage controls affected not just the immediate victims but entire generations of peasant families, who grew up understanding that their most intimate relationships were subject to the whims and desires of their social superiors. Children learned from an early age that their bodies and their futures belonged not to themselves but to the nobles who owned the land they lived on. The few legal protections that existed for peasants facing feudal marriage controls were often ineffective in practice, as they required access to courts and legal representation that were beyond the reach of most common people. Even when peasants managed to bring complaints against their lords, they faced judicial systems that were dominated by the same noble class that was oppressing them, making fair treatment unlikely. The gradual decline of feudal marriage controls occurred slowly over several centuries, driven by changes in economic systems, legal thinking, and social attitudes that made these practices less practical and more controversial. The growth of money-based economies reduced the importance of controlling peasant labor, while the development of more sophisticated legal systems provided alternative mechanisms for resolving disputes and maintaining social order. The legacy of feudal marriage controls continue to influence European society long after the formal end of the feudal system, shaping attitudes about class, authority, and women's rights that persisted well into the modern era. The idea that social superiors had legitimate claims on the personal lives and bodies of their inferiors remained embedded in legal and cultural traditions that were only slowly dismantled through centuries of struggle and reform. Understanding the reality of feudal marriage controls helps us recognize how systems of oppression can be maintained through the manipulation of basic human needs and desires. The control of marriage and sexuality has always been a powerful tool for maintaining social hierarchies, and the medieval experience demonstrates how this course can be used to devastating effect when it is supported by law, religion, and custom. The peasant families who suffered under feudal marriage controls were not passive victims but active agents who found ways to resist, adapt, and survive in the face of systematic oppression. Their strategies for maintaining dignity and family bonds despite overwhelming obstacles provide inspiration and insight for anyone seeking to understand how ordinary people can preserve their humanity in the face of institutional abuse and exploitation. The psychological devastation wrought by medieval marriage customs extended far beyond the wedding night itself, creating patterns of trauma that affected entire generations and shaped the fundamental structure of medieval society. The young women who survived these brutal initiation ceremonies carried their physical and emotional scars throughout their lives, developing complex coping mechanisms that allowed them to function in a world that offered them no protection, no justice, and no hope of escape from their circumstances. The immediate aftermath of traumatic wedding nights left many brides in a state of shock and dissociation that could last for weeks or months. Medical understanding of psychological trauma was virtually non-existent in medieval times, so these women received no treatment or support for their suffering. Instead, they were expected to immediately assume their roles as wives and household managers, pretending that nothing unusual had happened while privately struggling with nightmares, anxiety, and a deep-seated fear of intimate contact with their husband. The development of what we would now recognize as post-traumatic stress disorder was common among medieval wives, though it was never identified or treated as a medical condition. Women would experience intrusive memories of their wedding nights, sudden episodes of panic when confronted with reminders of their trauma, and a persistent sense of hypervigilance that made normal daily activities feel threatening and dangerous. These symptoms were often interpreted by their families and communities as signs of moral weakness, spiritual failing, or divine punishment, rather than as natural responses to severe trauma. The social isolation experienced by newly married women compounded their psychological distress in ways that made recovery nearly impossible. Cut off from their birth families and surrounded by strangers who viewed them primarily as breeding stock and domestic servants, these women had no one to confide in about their experiences or seek comfort from during their darkest moments. The expectation that they should be grateful for their marriages and happy about their new circumstances made it impossible for them to express their true feelings without risking additional punishment or rejection. Many medieval wives developed elaborate psychological defense mechanisms to protect themselves from the ongoing trauma of their daily lives. Dissociation became a survival strategy that allowed them to mentally separate themselves from physical and emotional abuse, creating an internal world where they could retreat when external circumstances became unbearable. Others developed rigid perfectionism in their domestic duties, believing that if they could just be good enough wives and mothers, they might earn better treatment from their husbands and family. The religious framework of medieval society provided both comfort and additional trauma for women struggling with the aftermath of brutal marriages. While faith could offer hope for eventual divine justice and eternal reward for earthly suffering, religious teachings also reinforced the idea that women were inherently sinful and that their suffering was a deserved consequence of Eve's transgression. This theological interpretation of female pain prevented women from recognizing their experiences as unjust and made them more likely to blame themselves for their circumstance. The phenomenon of learned helplessness was particularly pronounced among medieval wives, who quickly discovered that resistance to their circumstances resulted in increasingly severe punishment, while compliance offered the possibility of slightly better treatment. Over time, many women stopped even attempting to assert their own needs or preferences, instead focusing all their energy on anticipating and fulfilling their husband's demands in hopes of avoiding violence or rejection. The impact of trauma on maternal relationships was devastating for both mothers and children in medieval families. Women who had been severely traumatized by their own marriages often struggled to form healthy emotional bonds with their children, viewing them as potential sources of additional suffering rather than sources of joy and fulfillment. The constant stress of trying to protect their children from the same fate they had experienced while lacking any real power to do so created chronic anxiety that affected every aspect of family life. Children, raised in households dominated by marital trauma, absorbed lessons about power, violence, and gender relationships that would shape their own future relationships and parenting practices. Boys learned that masculine identity was expressed through the domination and control of women, while girls learned that their primary value lay in their ability to endure suffering without complaint. These lessons were reinforced by the broader social environment, creating cycles of abuse that persisted across generations. The The few women who managed to develop some degree of psychological resilience in the face of medieval marriage customs often did so through the cultivation of meaningful relationships with other women in similar circumstances. These friendships, conducted largely in secret and often centered around domestic work or religious observance, provided crucial emotional support and practical advice that helped women survive their daily challenges. The seasonal rhythms of medieval life created additional psychological stresses for traumatized wives, as certain times of year became associated with increased violence or unwanted sexual attention. The long, dark winters confined families in small spaces with little privacy, increasing opportunities for abuse and making escape impossible. Harvest festivals and other celebrations often involved increased alcohol consumption that made violent husbands even more dangerous and unpredictable. The lack of effective contraception in medieval society meant that traumatized wives faced the additional stress of frequent pregnancies that they were powerless to prevent or control. Each pregnancy brought the risk of death in childbirth, the certainty of months of physical discomfort and vulnerability, and the knowledge that any children born would likely face the same brutal circumstances that had shaped their own lives. The economic dependence of medieval wives on their husbands created additional psychological pressures that made resistance or escape virtually impossible. Women who had been raised to be completely dependent on male protection and provision had no practical skills for surviving independently, even if they had been legally permitted to leave their marriages. This economic helplessness reinforced their psychological trauma by making their circumstances feel truly inescapable. The social stigma associated with marriage problems made it nearly impossible for medieval wives to seek help or support from their communities when they were being abused or mistreated. Women who complained about their husband's behavior were seen as ungrateful troublemakers who were threatening the social order, while those who showed visible signs of abuse were often blamed for provoking their husbands rather than receiving sympathy or assistance. The religious practice of confession provided both potential relief and additional trauma for medieval wives struggling with the psychological aftermath of brutal marriages. While the opportunity to speak privately about their experiences could provide some emotional release, the requirement to frame their suffering in terms of sin and divine punishment often reinforced feelings of guilt and self-blame that prevented genuine healing. The development of what we might recognize today as depression was extremely common among medieval wives, though it was typically interpreted as spiritual sloth or moral weakness, rather than as a medical condition requiring treatment. The hopelessness that characterized many women's daily experiences was seen as a failure of faith, rather than as a natural response to genuinely hopeless circumstances. Some women developed elaborate fantasy lives that allowed them to psychologically escape their circumstances even when physical escape was impossible. These mental retreats might involve imagining different lives for themselves, creating detailed interior narratives about loved ones who had died, or developing intense spiritual experiences that provided temporary relief from their suffering. The impact of trauma on physical health was significant and often fatal for medieval wives, though the connection between psychological distress and physical illness was not understood at the time. Women who had been severely traumatized often developed chronic health problems including digestive disorders, chronic pain, and susceptibility to infections that further compromised their ability to cope with their difficult circumstances. The few documented cases of medieval women who successfully resisted or escaped their traumatic marriages reveal the extraordinary courage and resourcefulness required to overcome the systemic obstacles facing abused wives. These women often had to abandon their children, give up any hope of social respectability, and accept lives of poverty and marginalization in exchange for freedom from abuse. The social dynamics within extended families created additional sources of trauma for medieval wives, as they were often subjected to criticism, interference, and abuse from their husbands' relatives as well as their spouses. Mother-in-laws who had themselves survived traumatic marriages often perpetuated cycles of abuse by treating their sons' wives with the same cruelty they had experienced. viewing this as normal and necessary behavior rather than recognizing it as harmful. The lack of legal protections for medieval wives meant that their psychological trauma was compounded by the knowledge that society not only tolerated their abuse, but actively endorsed it as necessary for maintaining proper social order. This institutional betrayal made recovery more difficult by preventing women from developing the sense of righteous anger that might have helped them resist their circumstances. The seasonal and religious calendar of medieval life created rhythmic patterns of hope and despair for traumatized wives. As feast days and celebrations that should have brought joy instead often marked occasions when their suffering increased. Christmas, Easter, and other important religious holidays frequently involved family gatherings that increased stress and provided additional opportunities for abuse and humiliation. The psychological impact of medieval marriage customs was not limited to wives, but affected entire communities that had to witness and participate in systems of organized abuse, while pretending that these practices were normal and acceptable. The cognitive dissonance required to maintain social functioning while regularly participating in or witnessing traumatic events created psychological stress that influenced broader cultural attitudes about violence, authority, and human worth. Understanding the psychological and social effects of medieval marriage customs helps us recognize how trauma can become embedded in social structures and cultural practices, creating systems of oppression that persist across generations. The medieval experience demonstrates how individual suffering can be systematized and normalized through legal, religious, and cultural institutions that present abuse as necessary for maintaining social order. The resilience shown by medieval women in the face of systematic trauma and oppression provides inspiration for anyone seeking to understand how human beings can maintain their dignity and humanity even in the most difficult circumstances. Their strategies for survival, resistance, and mutual support offer valuable insights into the complex ways that individuals and communities can adapt to hostile environments, while preserving essential aspects of human connection and hope. The long-term psychological effects of medieval marriage customs extended far beyond the individual women who directly experienced them, influencing cultural attitudes about gender, authority, and violence that continued to shape European society for centuries after the specific practices of the medieval period had been abandoned. Understanding this legacy helps us recognize how historical trauma can continue to influence contemporary social problems and provides insight into the long process of healing that is required to overcome systematic oppression. The gradual transformation of marriage customs in medieval Europe did not happen overnight, nor did it occur through sudden enlightenment or humanitarian concern for women's suffering. Instead, change came slowly, driven by complex interactions between economic shifts, legal developments, religious reforms, and social pressures that made the most brutal aspects of medieval marriage increasingly impractical and socially problematic. The growth of urban centers and money-based economies during the later medieval period began to undermine the feudal system that had supported many of the most oppressive marriage customs. As trade expanded and craft guilds developed, new forms of economic organization emerged that offered alternatives to the rigid agricultural hierarchies that had dominated earlier centuries. Women in urban environments, while still severely constrained by law and custom, sometimes found opportunities to participate in commerce and crafts production that gave them slightly more autonomy and economic value beyond their reproductive capacity. The rise of canon law as a sophisticated legal system created new tensions with secular marriage customs that had previously gone unchallenged. Church scholars began to develop more elaborate theories about the nature of marriage as a sacrament, emphasizing the importance of mutual consent and spiritual partnership in ways that conflicted with practices like forced child marriage and prima nocta. While these theoretical developments had limited immediate impact on actual marriage practices, they provided intellectual foundations for later reforms. The Black Death and other demographic catastrophes of the 14th century dramatically altered the economic and social landscape of medieval Europe in ways that ultimately benefited women's status within marriage. The massive population losses created labor shortages that made women's economic contributions more valuable, while the disruption of traditional social hierarchies created opportunities for social mobility that had been impossible during periods of stability and growth. Legal developments during the later medieval period gradually began to place some limitations on the most extreme forms of marital abuse, though progress was slow and uneven across different regions and social classes. The concept that wives had some rights that deserved legal protection began to emerge in certain jurisdictions, particularly in urban areas where economic relationships were more complex and traditional feudal authorities had less direct control. The influence of courtly love literature and romantic ideals, while primarily affecting noble classes, began to introduce cultural concepts that challenged some aspects of purely transactional approaches to marriage. The idea that emotional compatibility and mutual affection might be desirable elements of marriage relationships was still revolutionary and rarely implemented in practice, but it provided alternative models for thinking about relationships between men and women. Religious reform movements within the Catholic Church, while generally conservative on issues of gender and sexuality, sometimes produced changes that inadvertently improved women's situations. The emphasis on spiritual equality before God created theological tensions with practices that treated women as purely physical property, while reforms that strengthened church authority over marriage sometimes limited the arbitrary power of secular lords. The gradual development of more sophisticated medical knowledge began to challenge some of the folk beliefs that had supported the most harmful marriage customs. As understanding of female anatomy and reproductive health slowly improved, some of the practices associated with virginity testing and consummation verification began to seem less reliable and more problematic, though medical advances during the medieval period remained extremely limited. Economic changes that reduced the importance of agricultural labor and increased the value of skilled crafts and commerce created new roles for women that extended beyond their traditional functions as wives and mothers. While these opportunities remained severely limited by legal restrictions and social prejudices, they provided some women with alternatives to marriages that might have been economically necessary in earlier periods. The growth of literacy and education, while still restricted primarily to elite classes, began to create communities of educated women who could articulate critiques of traditional marriage customs and develop alternative models for female achievement and fulfillment. Religious communities sometimes provided environments where women could pursue intellectual and spiritual development that was impossible within traditional marriage relationships. The emergence of stronger royal governments and more centralized legal systems began to limit some of the arbitrary powers that feudal lords had exercised over their subjects' marriages. While royal authority was often just as oppressive as feudal control, the development of more systematic legal procedures sometimes provided mechanisms for challenging the most extreme abuses of traditional marriage customs. Cultural exchanges with other societies through trade, crusades, and diplomatic contacts exposed Europeans to alternative approaches to marriage and gender relationships that challenged some assumptions about the natural inevitability of their own customs. While these exchanges were limited and often resulted in increased hostility toward foreign practices, they sometimes provided intellectual resources for questioning traditional approaches. The gradual development of urban middle classes created new social environments, where traditional aristocratic and peasant marriage customs were less relevant, and where new forms of family organization could develop. While these emerging middle-class marriages were still far from equal partnerships, they sometimes involved greater consultation between spouses and more consideration of women's preferences than had been typical in feudal society. The slow transformation of medieval marriage customs was not a simple story of progressive improvement. as many changes that seemed beneficial for women in some respects actually created new forms of constraint and control in others. The emphasis on romantic love and emotional compatibility that emerged during the later medieval period, for example, created new pressures for women to appear happy and satisfied with their circumstances regardless of their actual experiences. The consolidation of legal systems during the later medieval period sometimes resulted in the codification of discriminatory practices that had previously been informal customs, making women's legal disabilities more systematic and harder to challenge. The development of more sophisticated theories about natural law and divine order sometimes provided new intellectual justifications for old forms of oppression. The impact of religious reforms was similarly ambiguous, as movements that emphasized spiritual equality and personal relationship with God sometimes coexisted with intensified efforts to control women's sexuality and limit their public roles. The witch trials that began during the later medieval period and intensified during the early modern era demonstrate how religious reform could actually worsen women's situations in some contexts. The economic changes that created new opportunities for some women also created new vulnerabilities for others, as traditional forms of protection and support were disrupted without being replaced by adequate alternatives. Women who had been supported by feudal obligations and customary relationships sometimes found themselves more vulnerable to abandonment and abuse in market-based economies that emphasized individual responsibility and competition. The slow pace of change in medieval marriage customs reflected the deep embedding of these practices in legal, religious, economic, and cultural systems that reinforced each other in complex ways. Challenging marriage customs required simultaneous changes in multiple areas of social organization, making reform extremely difficult and slow even when individual reformers clearly recognized the problems with existing practices. The resistance to changing marriage customs came not only from men who benefited from women's subordination, but also from women who had invested their identities and survival strategies in existing systems and who feared that changes might leave them worse off than before. The psychological adaptations that allowed women to survive in oppressive marriages sometimes made them advocates for maintaining the systems that oppressed them. The legacy of medieval marriage customs continued to influence European society long after the specific practices we have examined had been abandoned or modified. Ideas about male authority, female submission, and the primacy of family interests over individual rights that were developed during the medieval period provided foundations for later legal and cultural developments that perpetuated gender inequality in new forms. The documentation of medieval marriage customs in legal codes, religious texts, and literary works created permanent records that could be referenced by later generations seeking to justify similar practices or resist changes that threatened traditional gender hierarchies. The authority of historical precedent gave medieval practices continuing influence even in periods when social conditions had changed dramatically. Understanding the slow and uneven process of change in medieval marriage customs provides important insights into how social reform occurs and why progress in human rights is never guaranteed or permanent. The medieval experience demonstrates that beneficial changes often occur as unintended consequences of other developments rather than through conscious humanitarian efforts, making sustained progress dependent on maintaining favorable conditions across multiple areas of social organization. The courage and resilience shown by medieval women who resisted oppressive marriage customs within the severe constraints of their historical circumstances provides inspiration for contemporary efforts to challenge gender inequality and protect human rights. Their strategies for survival, resistance, and mutual support offer valuable models for anyone seeking to create positive change in difficult circumstances. The medieval experience with marriage customs also demonstrates how practices that seem obviously harmful and unjustifiable to later generations can become so deeply embedded in social institutions that they appear natural and inevitable to the people who participate in them. This historical perspective encourages humility about our own social arrangements and vigilance about practices that future generations may judge as harshly as we judge medieval marriage customs. The transformation of marriage from a primarily economic and political institution into a relationship based on mutual affection and partnership represents one of the most significant social changes in human history. While this transformation is far from complete even today, and while new forms of inequality and exploitation continue to emerge, the progress that has been made demonstrates the possibility of fundamental change in even the most entrenched social institutions. The women who suffered through medieval wedding nights and the marriages that followed were not different from us in their capacity for love, joy, creativity, and fulfillment. They were trapped by historical circumstances that denied them opportunities to develop and express their full humanity, but their essential human dignity remained intact despite the systems that sought to crush it. Their stories remind us that the freedoms and protections we enjoy today were not inevitable products of social evolution, but were achieved through centuries of struggle, sacrifice, and gradual change. The progress that has been made in recognizing women's rights and human dignity more generally represents a precious inheritance that must be actively maintained and defended against forces that would reverse it. Tonight, as we conclude our examination of these dark chapters in human history, we honor the memory of countless women whose names were never recorded, whose pain was never acknowledged, and whose dreams were never allowed to flourish. Their suffering was not meaningless. If it helps us understand the true cost of inequality and the precious value of the freedoms that their suffering was not meaningless. If it helps us understand the true cost of inequality and the precious value of the freedoms that their sacrifices ultimately helped to secure. The medieval wedding night, with all its brutality and trauma, serves as a stark reminder that human progress is neither automatic nor permanent. The young brides who endured these ordeals were not casualties of a distant, primitive past. They were human beings with the same capacity for love, hope, and happiness that we possess today. They lived in a world that systematically denied them these basic human experiences, not because they were inherently different or less deserving, but because they had the misfortune to be born into a social system that valued property over persons and power over dignity. The customs and practices we have explored tonight were not aberrations or exceptions to medieval life. They were the normal, expected, and legally sanctioned experiences of the vast majority of women in medieval Europe. They were supported by religious doctrine, justified by legal tradition, and reinforced by economic necessity in ways that made them seem not just inevitable but morally correct to the people who participated in them. This historical perspective should give us pause when we consider our own social arrangements and cultural practices. How many customs that we accept as normal and natural today will appear barbaric and incomprehensible to future generations? What forms of suffering do we tolerate or ignore because they have become so deeply embedded in our social institutions that we cannot imagine alternatives? The gradual transformation of marriage from a form of legalized oppression into something approaching a partnership between equals represents one of humanity's great achievements, though it remains incomplete and fragile even today. The progress that has been made was not the result of sudden enlightenment or moral awakening, but emerged slowly through the accumulated efforts of countless individuals who refused to accept that suffering and injustice were inevitable features of human relationships. The medieval brides whose stories we have told tonight could not have imagined a world where women could choose their own partners, control their own bodies, pursue their own dreams, and live as equals rather than as property. Yet their suffering helped create the conditions that eventually made such a world possible. Every act of resistance, however small, every moment of solidarity between women, every instance of compassion that transcended social boundaries, contributed to the slow accumulation of changes that eventually transformed human relationships. The economic forces that began to undermine feudal marriage customs during the later medieval period demonstrate how social change often occurs through the intersection of material conditions and human agency rather than through abstract moral progress. As women gained access to new forms of economic activity and as traditional hierarchies were disrupted by demographic and technological changes, opportunities emerged for challenging practices that had previously seemed unchangeable. The legal developments that gradually placed some limits on marital abuse show how institutional change can both reflect and promote shifts in cultural attitudes. While law often lags behind social change, legal reforms can also create frameworks that protect vulnerable individuals and establish principles that guide future development. The slow recognition of women's legal rights, however limited, provided foundations that could be built upon by later generations seeking more comprehensive reforms. The religious movements that began to emphasize spiritual equality and personal relationship with God, despite their many contradictions and limitations, introduced concepts that ultimately challenged systems of dominance and subordination based on birth, gender, or social position. While religious authorities often resisted the implications of their own teachings about human dignity and divine love, these ideas provided intellectual and moral resources that could be used to critique oppressive practices. The cultural changes that began to value emotional compatibility and mutual affection in marriage, while initially limited to elite classes and often romanticized in unrealistic ways, represented a fundamental shift in how people thought about relationships between men and women. The idea that marriage could be based on choice rather than compulsion, on partnership rather than domination, created new possibilities for human flourishing that had been unimaginable in earlier periods. Yet we must also acknowledge that progress in human rights is never simply linear or permanent. The same periods that saw some improvements in women's status also witnessed new forms of persecution and control, as the witch trials and religious wars of the early modern period demonstrate. Social change is always contested, and those who benefit from existing arrangements of power will always resist challenges to their privileges. The experience of medieval women reminds us that individual resilience and mutual support are essential resources for surviving and ultimately changing oppressive circumstances. The informal networks of friendship and assistance that developed among medieval wives, the strategies they developed for protecting themselves and their children, and the ways they found to maintain their dignity and humanity despite overwhelming obstacles, provide models that remain relevant today. The slow pace of historical change should not discourage us from working for justice in our own time, but it should remind us that meaningful change requires sustained effort across multiple generations, and that setbacks and reversals are inevitable parts of any process of social transformation. The women who suffered through medieval marriage customs could not have anticipated how their experiences would ultimately contribute to the expansion of human freedom, but their courage in the face of impossible circumstances helped create the foundations upon which later progress was built. The documentation and memory of historical injustices serve important functions in contemporary struggles for human rights. By understanding how systems of oppression operated in the past, we can better recognize similar patterns in the present and develop more effective strategies for challenging them. The medieval experience with marriage customs reveals how legal, religious, economic, and cultural institutions can work together to normalize and perpetuate practices that cause enormous human suffering, while appearing legitimate and necessary to those who participate in them. The psychological insights we can gain from studying the experiences of medieval women provide valuable perspectives on how trauma affects individuals and communities across generations. The coping strategies developed by women who survived brutal marriages, the ways that trauma was transmitted from mothers to children, and the long-term effects of systematic oppression on entire societies offer lessons that remain relevant for understanding contemporary forms of abuse and exploitation. The medieval period reminds us that human beings are capable of adapting to almost any circumstances, including those that severely constrain their freedom and dignity. This adaptability has been essential for survival throughout history, but it also creates the danger that we may become too accepting of conditions that should be challenged and changed. The challenge for any generation is to distinguish between circumstances that must be endured and those that can and should be transformed. As we reach the end of our journey through these dark chapters of medieval history, it is important to remember that we are not simply observers of a distant past, but participants in an ongoing process of human development that connects us directly to the women whose stories we have shared tonight. Their suffering was not abstract or theoretical. It was as real and immediate as any pain we might experience today. Their dreams and hopes, though constrained by circumstances we can barely imagine, were as vivid and meaningful as our own. The progress that has been made since medieval times in recognizing women's rights and human dignity more generally should not make us complacent about the work that remains to be done. Throughout the world today, there are still women and girls who face circumstances that echo the brutalities of medieval marriage customs. Forced marriage, child marriage, and various forms of sexual exploitation continue to deny millions of people the basic human rights that we have come to take for granted. The medieval experience teaches us that change is possible, even in the most seemingly hopeless circumstances. But it also reminds us that such change requires conscious effort, sustained commitment, and the willingness to challenge practices and institutions that may seem natural and inevitable to those who participate in them. The young brides whose suffering we have chronicled tonight could not change their circumstances, but their experiences became part of a larger historical process that eventually created possibilities for human freedom they could never have imagined. Tonight, as you settle into your warm, safe bed, perhaps take a moment to remember the countless women who endured cold, fearful nights in medieval chambers, who faced each dawn wondering if they would survive another day, and who found ways to maintain their humanity despite systems designed to crush their spirits. Their legacy lives on, not only in the freedoms we enjoy today, but in the ongoing responsibility we share to protect and extend those freedoms for future generations. The story of medieval marriage customs is ultimately a story about the resilience of the human spirit and the possibility of transformation. Even in the darkest circumstances, it reminds us that progress is never guaranteed, but is always possible when people refuse to accept that suffering and injustice are permanent features of human existence. The medieval brides who suffered in silence helped create a world where their stories could finally be told, where their pain could be acknowledged, and where their dreams of dignity and freedom could eventually be realized. Their voices, silenced for so long by the circumstances of their time, speak to us across the centuries with a message that remains urgently relevant today: that every human being deserves to be treated with dignity and respect, that love should be based on choice rather than compulsion, and that the progress we have made in recognizing these truths must be vigilantly protected and continually extended until they become reality for all people, everywhere, in every time. In their memory, and in service of those who still struggle against oppression in our own time, we must continue the work of building a world where no one will ever again have to endure what they endured, where wedding nights will be celebrations of joy rather than occasions of terror, and where every person will be free to choose their own path toward love, fulfillment, and happiness. This is the debt we owe to the past and the gift we can offer to the future: a commitment to the proposition that human dignity is not negotiable and that every person deserves the chance to live as they choose rather than as others would force them to live. The medieval period ended long ago, but the questions it raises about power, justice, and human rights remain eternally relevant. May their stories guide us toward greater wisdom, deeper compassion, and stronger commitment to creating a world worthy of the best dreams of all who came before us and all who will come after us.